So Happy New Year. A little early. Next year, tomorrow, when we wake up, what year is it? 2024, right? And 2024 is about how many years it's been since the very first Christmas. Now, we weren't so good at starting the counting, and so it wasn't exactly 2024 years ago. But when we imagine when the first Christmas happened, when Jesus was born, was a little over 2,000 years ago, give or take, right? So whenever we tell a story about Jesus, it's a story that happened a very long time ago. And today I'm going to tell a story about somebody named Saint Francis. And Saint Francis lived 800 years ago, which is also a very long time in the past, but it was also 1,200 years beyond Jesus. So a long time ago for us, but it was a long time between Jesus and Francis. And so you can imagine that the stories and all of the things that we tell every Christmas season are in some ways the same, in some ways different to the life of Francis. But this year, 2023, marks the 800th anniversary of this Christmas story in the town of Greccio. So you want to hear a story? All right. Once, there was a very faithful person whose name was Francis. And Francis loved Jesus. Francis loved the gospel of Jesus, loved the way that Jesus took care of folks that were all around him. And Francis wanted nothing more than to live like Jesus and to help others live like Jesus. Francis had a good friend whose name was Claire, and Claire also loved Jesus. And so Francis and Claire started gathering other folks from first their hometown of Assisi, but then throughout the Italian countryside, and then even further beyond that, folks who wanted to live like Jesus. Well, whenever a group starts growing bigger and bigger, the things that you used to just be able to do in a one-on-one conversation now needed some structure and some order. If we can imagine how small groups work in large communities, we know that the community has to figure out how all of these little groups work together for a whole. And this is what was going on in Francis' life in the year 1223. His community of friends who all wanted to live like Jesus had grown so big that now there had to be guidance, a covenant, and understanding of what it meant to live in this way. And so Francis had to travel all the way to Rome, which was a very long walk from Assisi. And he had to say, this is how our community is going to live together. And then bring that rule back to all of the Franciscans. And he remembered when it was just a few of his closest friends, when it was just him and Claire having conversations. But now it was so much bigger. And Francis was having a hard time understanding, is this still helping us love Jesus and live like Jesus? So these are all the things that Francis was thinking about as he was walking through the Italian countryside down to Rome and then returning back home. And this was a path that he had traveled several times before, and he knew every time he got to the village of Greccio, that it just made his heart sing. Because here was a whole village, not only of folks who would worship together on Sunday mornings, but a whole village where the story of Jesus was alive in their homes and in their neighborhood. That these were folks who would live out the story of Jesus in caring for one another and in knowing the story of Jesus, not just as something that they listened to on a Sunday, but something they lived every day. So Francis always loved this town, and every time he went there, he would pause and go into a small cave on the outskirts of town where he would enter into a time of prayer. But in that cave, he knew he was surrounded by these great faithful neighbors. And as it would happen, on this return trip from Rome, he was going to be in the town of Greccio right at Christmas. And he loved the townspeople so much. He wanted to do something very special. He wanted to help all of the folks in the community know this story about the baby Jesus, but not just as something that happened once upon a time. And so he started having this plan. And he went to his buddy John, who lived in Greccio, and he said, "John, I need some help. Can you get..." And he just whispered the plan because he didn't want everybody to know what was about to happen. But John thought this was a pretty great idea. And so John went about on Francis' plan, pulling together all of the things that folks had wanted. And then the holy night came. And all of the townspeople in Greccio gathered in the town square. And they had candles and lanterns. And they were singing hymns of joy. And they processed, they moved, they walked out of that town square, past the houses and shops, out to the outskirts of town and up the mountainside, heading to the cave where Francis would so often pray all alone. And when they came there, first, they smelled something. This wasn't the incense they were expecting to smell like when they went to worship. It was something earthier, like hay, and the smell of animals. And they thought, well, we've never seen animals in worship before. But then they started to hear it. A donkey, hee-haw, and a sheep. And the people were filled with wonder. They couldn't quite imagine what was happening. They all gathered around in the cave. And Francis started to tell the story. And he reminded the people of Greccio that Jesus is always being born in our midst, in the love that we have for one another. And that our connection with God isn't some far-off thing, but a God who is close to what we live, surrounded by smells and sounds. A hungry babe crying out to be nursed by Mother Mary. These were the sights and sounds of that first Christmas. And Francis wanted the people of Greccio to remember that God came to be human, born among us. Now, in the whispered plans that Francis had said to John. He said, I want there to be a manger with a rag doll placed there to symbolize the Christ child. But as the story was being told, as the townspeople filled the cave, as the candles flickered and the songs were sung and the animals were bleating and the smells were filling the air, the folks who gazed upon the manger didn't witness a simple baby doll, but were given a vision of the Christ child there, born among them. It was a Christmas that the people of Greccio would never forget. It was the first time a live nativity had ever been presented so that folks could imagine themselves in the story. And now, all these years later, that gift that Francis gave to the townspeople becomes a reminder for all of us of the true gift of this Christmas season. That Jesus cried like we cry, got hungry like we get hungry, got cranky like we get cranky, and could be comforted and held just as we could be comforted and held. That is what it means for Jesus to be born among us, today and always. And that's the story as it was told to me, and the story as I tell it to you. Amen.